I guess, I know this is probably a common one, but for me, I still struggle with it because I want to be able to have a defense when someone asks me why I keep the law or
Hmm.
why I cherish the law. And I had, a friend that just didn't want to be a friend of mine anymore. And it really disappointed me. I was like, wow, okay. And he says you follow a different Bible, and I'm like, well, that's crazy. So that made me kind of want to just have a defense of, you know, Paul, the Apostle Paul, has never
Hmm.
forsaked his Jewish identity. He was Jewish under a Gentile nation. He had citizenship.
Hmm.
So those verses, the Colossians, the the Hebrews kind of stumps me about the Sabbath, like when
Hmm.
it talks about the Sabbath, because a lot of people say the Sabbath is not brought up in the New Testament, but it is brought up, and it's brought up in the Hebrews. But
Yeah.
then it's like I'm still kind of stuck on that verse, so I'm still trying to figure out that verse. But those are the big questions, like Galatians. So what's the historical context, and why does Paul sound contradictory when he speaks to the Galatians and the Colossians?
Hmm.
And then I guess what I haven't done is to see how that falls into the Acts of the Apostles. Like, where does that line up? Because Paul in Acts, I don't know if it was 15, but he says, where he says he took a vow, and James is telling Paul, he's like, Paul, a lot of people think that you're against the law, that you're just
Yeah.
throwing it out. So that's a big thing for me because I really don't like. I know I believe it, but I don't know how to defend it.
Okay. Yeah, that's a lot of territory there. So I'm going to focus in on one specific aspect of that. And that's um, the passage in Galatians. You mentioned several passages, but two of them in particular appear to have a contradiction. In Galatians 5, Paul says, um, if you're circumcised, stay circumcised. If you're not, don't get circumcised. And if you go and get yourself circumcised, you're putting yourself under the law, and you're making Christ useless to you. At least I think that's all in Galatians 5. I might, it's somewhere in Galatians, anyways. Um, but then in Acts 21, which is another passage you referenced, Paul is accused of teaching the Jews to stop circumcising their children. And to prove that he was not teaching that, he went and he paid for some people to absolve a vow, which appears to be a Nazirite vow, and he went and did it himself. So he went and made sacrifices to show people, I'm not teaching against the law of Moses. I'm teaching people to keep it, and I'm keeping it myself. So how do we resolve that contradiction? Let's just pull up those texts so that we're, going through the motions here. Galatians 5. So I, Paul, say to you that if you accept circumcision, Christ will be of no advantage to you. I testify again to every man who accepts circumcision that he is obligated to keep the whole law. You are severed from Christ. You who would be justified by the law, you have fallen away from grace. And then the other one is Acts 21. This is the apostles talking to Paul. You see, brother, how many thousands there are among the Jews to those who have believed. They are all zealous for the law, and they have been told about you that you teach all the Jews who are among the Gentiles to forsake Moses, telling them not to circumcise the children or walk according to our customs. And we have 4 men who are under a vow. Take these men and purify yourself along with them and pay their expenses so that they may shave their heads. And that's how we know that this is a Nazirite vow. Thus all will know that there is nothing in what they have been told about you, but that you yourself also live in observance of the law. So, and Paul goes along with this. So he says, yes, I am in observance of the law, and he pays for these 4 men to complete their Nazirite vow, which involves shaving their head and offering a sacrifice. And he does so himself. So Paul is engaging in blood sacrifices many decades after the crucifixion and resurrection of Yeshua. And this is to prove that he is not teaching the Jews who live among the Gentiles not to circumcise his children. We know that the book of Galatians was not written to Jews specifically. It was written to believers in a region of the Roman Empire. There were Jews there. There were synagogues. So there would have been some Jews among those people. So this would be who the apostles are talking about, the Jews who live among the Gentiles. Now, it's possible, just from these bare texts, that Paul is saying, you Gentiles, don't go get yourself circumcised, but not the Jews. And this is the way a lot of people explain this, that the Jews are still supposed to keep all the laws. The Gentile converts, they don't have to worry about this. That's one possible resolution. On the other hand, there is nothing in Torah, nothing in the law that would say a grown man who lives in Galatia needs to go and get himself circumcised, whether he is a Jew or a Gentile. So if Paul were to write to the Galatians and say, you must be circumcised in order to be saved, or you must be circumcised, well, he would be violating the law. Unless God specifically told him that group of people needs to go get circumcised for some specific reason, which, God has done that.
When did God do that?
Well, there are a couple of times. The first time was with the house of Abraham. When God made the covenant with Abraham, he said, as part of this covenant, you and all the men in your household are going to get circumcised. And after that, you're going to circumcise your sons on the 8th day. So there are two different aspects to that. Another time is when Joshua brought the children of Israel across the Jordan River, and before they could keep Passover for the first time in the land, they all had to be circumcised because nobody had been circumcising their sons while they were in the wilderness. So the two times where God commands men to be circumcised, one, when they're 8-day-old boys, and two, when they're going to eat a Passover in the land of Israel. If you're outside the land of Israel, you can't technically eat a Passover because you're supposed to do it in that place where God said he would put his name. I interpret that as being the city of Jerusalem. Some people interpret that as being the temple itself. But that's a whole different question. Earlier in Acts, we have another controversy around Paul and circumcision. So this controversy came up a lot. So that's why Paul mentions it so many times. He mentions it in Romans, Galatians, I think somewhere in Corinthians. So back in Acts 15, there's a group of men. So these are probably what we might call Christian Pharisees. And they were believers in Yeshua, but they were saying that all these Gentile converts, they have to become Jews in order before we can consider them saved. And that means they have to go through this conversion process and then be circumcised. So, but that's not what the law says. As I just pointed out, it's 8-day-old boys and men who are going to eat a Passover who are commanded to be circumcised. When you join Israel, when you become a member of the Commonwealth of Israel, there's no requirement that you have to be circumcised in order to do that. Now, God may lead you to become circumcised later for some other reason, much as Paul had Timothy circumcised later because he was going to be a missionary to Jews in a certain place. I don't know exactly how they would know. Maybe they just ask, and Timothy wasn't going to lie. I don't know. I think that's what's really happening here. There's two different things happening. On the one hand, you have a group of Pharisee Christians. They were believers. They just didn't understand the difference between their traditions and God's commandments yet. And then you have all these Gentile believers who are coming into the faith. And these Pharisee believers were telling the Gentiles, you must be circumcised in order to be saved. And Paul is saying, no, if you believe them and you go get yourself circumcised in order to be saved, you're throwing Jesus under the bus. You're saying his sacrifice doesn't mean anything to me because it's the circumcision that saves me, becoming a Jew, not becoming a disciple of Yeshua. So I think that's the resolution of that particular contradiction. And of course, you wouldn't know that if you don't understand the law and how circumcision is laid out in the law, and then put all of these different pieces together. One thing that people love to do with Paul is take little bits and pieces out, soundbite theology, and act as if every sentence of Paul's letters is a letter all to itself. And That's just not the way any of Paul's letters work. He's writing within the context of all of his writing and all of the scriptures. And he assumes that the people he's writing to understand the scriptures, that he doesn't have to spell everything out for them. So he leaves a lot of stuff out, and he makes long, complicated arguments. You just can't extract a single statement and expect it to make any sense.
You're saying that circumcision, yes, we know it doesn't save you. It's not necessarily bad to be circumcised according to that, but it's not necessary to follow Jesus, basically.
Right.
And back in Genesis, with the circumcision, was that just an order at the time that by God to say, circumcise your children that are 8 days old? Do you know what was specifically said?
Yeah, it's here in Genesis 17. God, starting in verse 9, God said to Abraham, "As for you, you shall keep my covenant, you and your offspring after you throughout your generations. This is my covenant which you shall keep between me and you and your offspring after you. Every male among you shall be circumcised. You shall be circumcised in the flesh of your foreskin, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and you. He who is 8 days old among you shall be circumcised. Every male throughout your generations, whether born in your house or bought with your money from any foreigner who is not your offspring. Both he who is born in your house and he who is bought with your money shall surely be circumcised. So shall my covenant be in your flesh, an everlasting covenant. And any uncircumcised male who is not circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin shall be cut off from his people. He has broken my covenant." This is probably one of the places where I have to read a little bit into the text in order to make it all make sense.
Right, but what about the circumcising of the heart? Isn't that somewhere in there? Does that play a role into anything?
Yeah, it does. And that's the more important circumcision. I mean, that's the one you have to have. You cannot be a disciple of Yeshua with an uncircumcised heart. And having an uncircumcised heart having a circumcised heart is really just another way to say, being born again or being remade in the image of the Son of God. It is something that happens to you, and it is something that happens over time with your cooperation. You are saved from the moment that you put your faith in Yeshua and say, "I am submitted to him. I am repenting of my sins." You're saved. And now you are being saved as you live that out in your life. Study the word, apply it to your life, become more and more like Yeshua over time, and remain faithful. He who perseveres to the end will be saved. And so then you will be saved at the end when you are finally judged. I am saved, I am being saved, and I will be saved. Those are all true at the same time. And they all describe the process of circumcision of the heart. Now, as far as physical circumcision, if you were a man in Abraham's house at the time that God made this command, you had to submit to that circumcision or be kicked out of the family. All of his servants, all of these people would have been considered Abraham's house, even though they weren't his direct children. And then from that point on, any boy who is 8 days old must be circumcised. And later on, when God gives the commandments for Passover, he says, okay, you can't eat the Passover unless you're circumcised. So that's another place where you'd have to be circumcised. But I don't think where it says any uncircumcised male who is not circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin shall be cut off from his people, I don't think that applies to grown men who are adopted into Israel after this point. And one of the reasons I say that is, first off, because Paul said, and the other apostles said in Acts 15 and Acts 20, that nobody needs to be circumcised in order to be saved. And then later after Abraham, way before the apostles, nobody was circumcised in the wilderness. The 8-day-old boys, God is right there in the camp with them, and nobody is circumcising their sons. And if it was that critical to being counted as a citizen of Israel, surely God would have said something before they crossed the Jordan. But all through the wilderness, he keeps addressing them as the children of Israel. These are his people. He never counted them as not his people, despite not being circumcised. So that is not a qualification for being a part of Israel.